Historians hold the view that the stories which constitute the Ramayana of Valmiki were originally composed at different points of time and were later collated into a single text. Romila Thapar observed, it may be suggested that the Ramayana as we have it today went through various forms as did the Mahabharata. Fragmentary narratives from the oral tradition were probably selected and recomposed and compiled as an epic poem by Valmiki. Scholars like Brockington opines that the stories in Book 2 to 6, which constitute the initial version of the story, were composed in the 5th or 4th century BCE. In the two subsequent centuries, that is in the 3rd and the 2nd centuries BCE, stories in the Book 1 and 7 were composed. From the 4th to the 5th centuries AD, small passages were added. We have seen the story of the Ramayana and the organizational structure of the whole story. Now, what about Valmiki, the author of the Ramayana? We know that Valmiki plays two crucial roles in the Ramayana tradition. First of all, the first rendition of the Ramakatha is attributed to him. Secondly, he is also a pivotal character in his own text. We know practically nothing about the author called Valmiki, but Ramakatha gives us a mythological account of Valmiki's life. Ramakatha begins by explaining how Valmiki came to be a great sage. Valmiki's original name was Ratnagara. He was born into a robber family. One day, he tried to rob a sage who was going through the forest in which he was residing. The sage warned Valmiki that his heinous actions will result in his destruction. But he confidently told the sage that he is doing it for his family and they will also share his sins. The sage asked him to go and inquire with his family if they would share the sins of his action. Ratnagara, moved by this question of the sage, went and asked his wife if she would share his sins. But she told him that one has to share the burden of one's own sins. This brought about a crucial change in Ratnagara's mind. He came back to the sage and told him if there is any way to cleanse himself of his sins. His religious preceptor taught him the mantra, the apparently nonsensical mantra, Mara Mara. When Valmiki uttered the phrase repeatedly, the syllabus blended into Rama Rama, thereby accruing the meritorious karmic fruits of chanting Rama's name. Whatever may be the theory of historians about the genesis of Adi Kavya, the Ramayana self-reflexively proposes an altogether different story about its origin. According to the omniscient narrator of the text, the events which led to the composition of the Ramayana begin with Valmiki asking the celestial sage Narada about the worthiest of all human beings currently living on the earth. In response to this query, Narada tells Valmiki the legendary story of Rama, the king of Ayodhya. After this, Narada leaves and Valmiki, along with his disciple Bharadwaja, goes to the riverside for his prayers. At the riverside, Valmiki chances upon an act of violence, a hunter shooting one of a mating pair of birds. The sage, overcome with pity, curses the hunter, which surprisingly comes out in the form of a shloka. The shloka which comes out of Valmiki's grief goes like this: Ma nishada pradishtham tvamagama shashwadi samaha et kraunja midhuna degam avadihi kamamohidam. It means, since Nishada, you killed one of this pair of kraunjas who were at the height of their passion, you shall not live for very long. The first listener of the newly invented shloka is none other than Valmiki's disciple Bharadwaja. Here, it is significant to note that even though the shloka came out of the sage's outburst of grief, what the listener Bharadwaja ultimately elicits from the shloka is Ananda, or sheer aesthetic delight. The omniscient narrator says, when the sage uttered those words, the disciple learned them by heart with utmost delight. This scene, in fact, anticipates a notion that Kavya Shastra was going to set as the rule for literature. That is, Kavya aims to provide the readers with aesthetic pleasure or Ananda. The whole story of Rama that Valmiki composes in the Ramayana is replete with grief. But what the reader elicits from it is pleasure. The Ramayana repeatedly mentions this fact. For instance, the omniscient narrator details the expression of the sages who later listened to the story of Rama sung by Lava and Kusha, Rama's sons. The narrator says, when the sages heard it, their eyes were clouded with tears and filled with the greatest wonder. They all said to the two, Sadhu, Sadhu, or excellent, excellent. All the sages, glad at heart and loving righteousness, praised Kusha and Lava as they sung, for they were worthy of praise. As a token of their appreciation, one of the sages presented them a water jar. Another one gifted them a bark cloth mantle. This crucial point that Kavya aims to provide joy by something literary theoreticians are going to repeat over and over again in Kavya Shastra. For example, Abhinavagupta, in his commentary on Anandavarthana's Dhvanyaloka, says that the ontology of aesthetic relish is alaukika, or supernormal. Vishwanatha, in his Sahitya Darpana, even went to the extent of terming the experience of relishing a literary work Brahmaswada Sahodara, or the kin of spiritual bliss. Abhinavagupta, in his Lojana on Anandavarthana's Dhvanyaloka, points out that emotions evoked in aesthetic experience, irrespective of the fact whether it is painful or pleasurable in real life, are so non-ordinary that there is no question of sorrow. According to Kundaga, the primary aim of Kavya is to provide the readers with happiness or ahlada. We have been talking about the events which led to the composition of the first Kavya. Let's come back to it. So after inventing the shloka, the sage returns to his hermitage and finds Brahma, the lord of creation, patiently awaiting him. Brahma tells Valmiki that what he has just invented is a shloka and commands him to compose the whole story of Rama in it. He also assures the sage that whatever he says in his poem will be absolutely true. The omniscient narrator says that the whole story of Rama then appeared to Valmiki in a prophetic vision. He says, Tadaha pashyadi dharmatma tat sarvam yogamastidaha purayat tatra nirvurtam panava malagam yatha. It means, with the power of yoga, the righteous Valmiki clearly saw like an amalaka fruit in the palm of the hand the entire course of events that happened in the past relating to Rama. In early India, a poet was always seen as a prophet or seer. So one can say for certain that the idea of poet as a seer with a prophetic vision in fact begins with the Ramayana. We need to note that in the Ramayana, Valmiki is not simply reproducing the story of Rama in the same way he heard it from the celestial sage Narada. He transformed the story of Rama in a unique fashion. The omniscient narrator in the Ramayana talks about the peculiar way in which Valmiki retold the legend of Rama in Adi Kavya. The renowned sage, with his insight unparalleled, thus composed a kavya in a lot of shlokas in order to celebrate the glory of famous Rama. It contained symmetrically worded verses consisting of beautiful words with noble significations. Listen to the story of Rama composed in uncomplicated compounds, conjunctions and conjugations, and in delightful words that are expressive. Here we can see Valmiki deviating from the ordinary use of language to produce poetic language of Kavya, though this process is unconsciously made. In other words, he defamiliarizes the story of Rama that he heard from Narada. The idea of defamiliarization as the characteristic mark of Kavya also begins with the Ramayana. It is also significant that the associative term Samskrita as an adjective qualifying speech or language occurs for the first time in the Vālmīki Rāmāyaṇa, which is supposed to be composed in the last centuries before the Common Era. The demon king had disguised himself as a Brahman and abducted the princess Sita. And then Hanuman, the monkey scout of Prince Rama, comes to see Sita at the behest of Rama. But before meeting her, he pauses for a while, thinking in what language he should use. He thinks, if I, like a Brahman, I address Sita using Samskrita speech, she may think I am Ramana and will be frightened. Far better to speak a human language, one that will make sense to her. Though Kavya is often flaunted as a unique product created by Valmiki, it is very much possible to draw a parallel between Kavya and the Vedic tradition that antedated it. First of all, the use of defamiliarized language in versified form, which was later conceptualized as the hallmark of literary language, had already been used to its optimum by many Vedic scriptures such as Rigveda Samhita. The Vedas and Kavyas also had shared a common purpose. In other words, both these traditions ultimately aim to transform their readers into ideal subjects. The only difference was that while the Vedas performed this deontic function explicitly, Kavya served this purpose implicitly using aesthetic devices. In his commentary on Anandavarthana's Dhvanyaloka in the 9th century CE, Abhinavagupta talks about different ways in which the Vedas and Kavya carry out their deontic functions. According to Abhinavagupta, while Kavya implicitly instructs after the fashion of a wife, the Vedas explicitly instruct after the fashion of a master. Abhinava's observation about the deontic function of Kavya is not an isolated instance. We have in fact a host of literary theoreticians who agree with the idea that Kavya, like the Vedic scriptures, has a didactic function to perform. Above all, the liturgical formulas known as mantras were also referred to as sukti, and the Vedic hymns were called kavi. We need to note that sukti and kavi are the terms that were later employed by critics and creative writers to denote respectively poetry and poet. This shows that both Kavya and the Veda had a lot in common. Does it mean that the Veda was read poetically to relish aesthetic emotions? The answer is no. Despite all these provinces of convergence between the Vedas and Kavya, Sanskrit literary theoreticians never treated the Veda at par with Kavya. The Veda was regarded as a form of textuality totally different from Kavya. The same was the case with the mantra and the other genres of the Veda. They were not performed or read as literature at any point, nor were they selected for inclusion in literary anthologies. This shows that in early India, the difference between the Vedas and the Kavya was conceptualized not ontologically but functionally. To put it differently, though the Vedas shared many formal features of Kavya, the readers of Sanskrit literary tradition never chose to read them poetically. We have discussed a lot of points in the lecture. So, let's do a revision of the major ideas that we discussed in the lecture. The first thing that we discussed was the social history of Sanskrit language. We saw that before the beginning of the Common Era, Sanskrit was exclusively used for Vaidika affairs. While Sanskrit remained a language of dharma, Prakrit was the language of mundane affairs. It was only by the beginning of the Common Era that Sanskrit came out of the closet of Vaidika affairs to be used for worldly communicative practices like Kavya. According to the available historical evidence, the first extensive non-Vedic use of Sanskrit is found in the Junagadh inscription from what is now called Gujarat. It was constituted by the western Kshatrapa ruler Rudradaman to mark the reconstruction of a great water reservoir named Sudarshana, which was heavily damaged in a storm. Junagadh inscription is of particular importance in the history of Sanskrit language, primarily because of two reasons. First, it was the first extensive non-Vedic use of Sanskrit language, and secondly, it was the first extensive use of standard Sanskrit in the poetic style. We have also seen that Sanskrit's use for non-Vaidika affairs is also associated with the emergence of Kavya tradition. Scholars often opine that the maximum outer limit that we can set for the beginning of Kavya tradition is the last centuries before the advent of the Common Era, if that early. The text that is often recognized as Adi Kavya of or first Kavya in Sanskrit is Vālmīki's Rāmāyaṇa. The Ramayana is significant in the cultural history of Sanskrit Kavya not only because it was the first Kavya in Sanskrit, but also it was a meta-narrative self-reflexively talking about its own genesis. In this lecture, we also took a look at the importance of the first chapter of Ramayana titled Balakanda or the Book of Boyhood as a text anticipating some of the crucial observations in Kavya Shastra about the ontology of Kavya itself. The first observation was that Kavya provides the readers with delight even if the counterpart of that emotion in real life generate uneasiness in the readers in real life. The second observation was that the ontology of Kavya was considerably different from other uses of language. In other words, the language of Kavya needs to be distinct from the ordinary form of speech. It is also significant that the associative term Samskrita as an adjective qualifying speech or language occurs for the first time in the Vālmīki Rāmāyaṇa. In Sundarakanda, it was Hanuman who used the term Samskrita to refer to the language of Brahmins when he went to meet Sita in the Ashoka grove. The last point that we discussed in the lecture was the textual similarity between Kavya and Veda. We saw that both Kavya and the Veda had a lot in common. First of all, both Veda and Kavya used ornate language. Secondly, both Kavya and Veda aimed to instruct their readers about Dharma Vidhi. The only difference was that while Kavya performed this function implicitly, the Veda did it explicitly. This shows that both the Veda and Kavya had a lot in common both ontologically and teleologically. We have also seen that both Vedic hymnists and creative writers were called Kavi, and Sukti was a term used to refer to both the liturgical formulas known as mantras and poetry. But in spite of all these interfaces that the Veda and Kavya had in common, the Veda was never read poetically. The same was the case with mantras and the other genres of the Veda. They were not performed or read as literature at any point, nor were they selected for inclusion in literary anthologies. This shows that in early India, the difference between the Vedas and the Kavya was conceptualized not ontologically but functionally.